Okay, for today's read aloud, it has all the familiar feel of some of the Peter chapters that we are used to from previous books. It's a longer chapter. It's a chapter where we see two groups that have kind of been going about their business separately in the novel coming together, and that's an exciting point for the reader because you're anticipating what's going to happen when these two groups get together. It also does the kind of famous move that the authors like to do where we switch from an inside scene to an outside scene as the groups get closer and closer together with one another. So it's a good chapter, and it's a good chapter to finish out the week on. So chapter 46 is called One Light, One Dark. Grandfather, can you hear me? Wendy bent over Leonard Astor's gaunt, gray appearance, his lifeless face laying there. Peter, standing next to Wendy, was shocked to see this frail old man in place of the strong and courageous Starcatcher leader he once knew. Grandfather, please, wake up, said Wendy. It's no use, child, said Mrs. Bumbrake softly. She stood in the doorway, dabbing at her eyes. He's been like this for days. From downstairs, they heard the pounding on the big front doors and muffled shouts. Neville, apparently in the doorway, panting from hurrying up the stairs. I've locked all the doors. The police are trying to get in. The pounding on the doors got louder. Sooner or later, they'll break down the door. Or come through the window, said Peter. We've got to move Grandfather, said Wendy. How are we going to get him out? Through the back door, said Wendy. They're going to be waiting for us back there. What we need is a diversion. A what? Said Peter. Mrs. Bumbrake, do you have any flour? Any what? Flour, the kind you bake with. There's a sack in the kitchen downstairs, said Mrs. Bumbrake. But why? What about candles? Also in the kitchen, but no time to explain. Bring Leonard down to the rear door. And he was gone. As he left, Tinkerbell zoomed into the room. Bad men, she chimed to Peter. I know, the police. Not the police, she chimed. A very bad man. Peter wanted to ask more, but Wendy was tugging at his arm. We'll have to carry Grandfather, said Wendy. No, he's too weak, said Mrs. Bumbrake. A crashing sound echoed through the house. We've got to try, she said, slipping her arm under Leonard's shoulder. Grab his legs, and as Peter and Mrs. Bumbrake stepped forward, Leonard moaned. He's waking up, said Mrs. Bumbrake, and Leonard's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Wendy, then Peter, then Tinkerbell, and back on Wendy. The faintest of smiles formed on his lips, and in a voice so weak you could barely hear it, he said, You found him. Yes, Grandfather, said Wendy, tears welling up in her eyes. I found him. Wouldn't have found it without me, chimed Tinkerbell. Yes, of course, Tink, whispered Leonard, who was the only human being other than Peter who understood Tinkerbell. Thank you, Tinkerbell. And he reached a thin, bony hand toward Peter. We need your help. Don't let them the cash. Confess. He coughed again, unable to stop this time, his body curling up in pain. Another crash downstairs, louder than before. Footsteps on the stairs. John appeared in the doorway, breathless. Uncle Neville says you got to come down to the kitchen right now, he shouted. Then he turned and ran back down the stairs. Wendy leaned over her grandfather and said, Grandfather, the police are here. His eyes widened. No, you must go. There was another crash and the sound of splintering wood. Lock, said Leonard, his trembling hands reaching under his neck of his nightgown. Wendy saw a bit of fine gold chain in his fingers. And if you're smart, you can figure out what Leonard is trying to say when he's saying lock. He's got a locket, she said. She helped her grandfather pull the locket out from under the nightgown. It was identical to the locket her mother had given her. It's star stuff, she cried. Use it, said Leonard. Now, get away. He was fumbling with the clasp. Here, let me, said Wendy, taking the locket in her hands, and she undid the clasp. The glowing sphere of light surrounded her hands, and everyone in the room, despite the peril of the situation, suddenly felt really, really good. Are you going to use it, said Peter. No, said Wendy firmly. Grandfather is. Hearing this, Leonard reached his hand out to try to stop Wendy, but it was too late. With a flick of her wrist, she overturned the locket. Instantly, the room blazed with brightness as a shower of bright, brilliant light poured onto the old man's face and chest. Wendy and Peter and Mrs. Bumbrake, turning away, closed their eyes, hearing strange and wonderful music in the air. It was 10 seconds before they were able to reopen their eyes, and when they did, Leonard was no longer in bed. Instead, he stood before them in his nightgown. He was still gone, but his once pale skin now glowed with a ruddy health, and his eyes were clear and alert. "That star stuff wasn't for me," he told Wendy. "That was for you. We're not leaving you here, Grandfather." "I appreciate that, Wendy, but my time is done, and you must—" But he was cut off by a crash downstairs. "Maybe we should argue about this later," said Peter. "All right," said Leonard, once again in command. "Let's go." He started for the door, stopped, and said, "Just a moment." He went to his massive oak wardrobe, opened it, and pulled out a sword. He brandished it, his eyes shining. "Now we're ready. Like old times, eh, Peter?" "Yes, sir," said Peter. If you think back to the last time we saw Leonard and Peter with a sword, of course it was in Rondoon down in the dungeon. "Come on," said Leonard, moving quickly out the door, followed by the other three. At the bottom of the stairs, they stopped to look toward the front door, and as they did, it shuddered with a loud crash, and the men outside heaved against it. "That door won't hold much longer," he said. "Tink, go outside and have a look at the back door. We'll meet you down in the kitchen." "Yes, sir," chimed Tinker Bell, streaking to the main fireplace up the chimney. Leonard shepherded Mrs. Bumbrake, Wendy, and Peter onto the kitchen stairs. He followed them, stopping on the top step to push a heavy door close, then locked it. "I had this door installed years ago, when I thought I might need it to barricade the family in the basement. Never thought I would need it until now, and it's stronger than the front door. They won't be getting through it anytime soon." With a crash from the other side of the door, the sound of shouting and heavy shoes tromping up the wooden floors could be heard. "They're in the house. We best get down to the kitchen." In the kitchen, they found John and Michael with Uncle Neville, who had a large cloth sack of flour in the middle of the floor. "Hello, Leonard. You're looking well," said Neville. "Thank you, Neville. Nice to see you. Why have you put a flour sack on the floor?" "Oh, to make a bomb," said Neville. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bumbrake. "Uncle Neville's gonna explode the kitchen," said Michael. "It's explode, you ninny." "That's what I said," said Michael. So, before we continue, obviously this is the disclaimer where I tell you, do not try what Uncle Neville is trying at home. That being said, we will continue. There was a pounding on the door at the top of the kitchen stairs. "What do you mean, a bomb?" Well, flour particles, if you get enough of them suspended in the air and then introduce a flame," he waved an unlit candle and a box of matches, "you get quite a dramatic explosion. I've done some experiments on my estate, lost a building, in fact. Fortunately, no one was in it at the time." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bumbrake. The pounding got louder. "So your plan is to set off the explosion here?" he said. "Precisely. We'll stamp on the flour." He brought his right foot down, which blew out a cloud of flour directly onto Leonard, covering him in head-to-toe white. "Oh, sorry." "Quite all right," said Leonard, brushing the flour off. "Go on." "Yes, by stomping on the flour, we'll fill the air with flour particles. Then we nip into the pantry over there, toss a lighted candle into the kitchen, and this will cause an explosion. And we'll be able to escape." "I'm not so sure exactly how," said Wendy, but she stopped as Tinker Bell zoomed in through the kitchen fireplace chimney, chiming excitedly. "Interesting," said Leonard. "What is it?" said Wendy. "The policemen, there's only 3 upstairs pounding on the door. The rest are all waiting outside the back door." "Why aren't they trying to get in the back door then?" said Wendy. "It's a trap. They want us to run out the back door, into their clutches." "Should we try to go upstairs?" "There are 3 men that way. We might be able to fight our way through, but—" He trailed off, looking at Mrs. Bumbrake and the boys. "What do we do?" "We open the back door." "We do?" said Peter. "We do," said Leonard with a small smile. "Now listen closely," and it took him several minutes to explain the plan. The others listened in silence except for Mrs. Bumbrake, who said, "Oh, dear," 4 times. When Leonard was done, he dragged the flour sack into the hallway next to the back door, then stomped on it until the air was thick with flour dust. He was now totally and completely white. He returned to the kitchen, tucked his sword under his arm, and took the candle matches from Neville. The pounding from the stairway door continued unabated. "All right," he said, "go to your positions." Mrs. Bumbrake, Neville, John, and Michael headed for the pantry. Wendy and Peter, with Tinkerbell inside of Peter's shirt, started for the stairway. Leonard put out a white hand, stopping them. When you get out of here, go straight to a hotel in Sloane Square called the Scotland Landing. But you'll be with us, said Wendy. Leonard put his hand on her shoulder. Wendy, I will try, but this star stuff is going to wear off, and when it does, I shall be as bad off as I was before, if not worse. But, no, Wendy, I've had my time. This is your time. Don't fail us, Wendy. Don't fail the star catchers. His voice was breaking up, and he pushed Wendy gently towards the stairway, then turned away toward the flower-filled hall. Wendy was about to call out to him, but there was so much more she needed to know. But it was too late. Leonard was opening the box of matches. So now we're going to shift scenes from here briefly to outside so we can get the different perspective. The policemen out back, several large, tough men, were growing impatient. Nah, why don't we just break the door down, said one of them. Several agreed. Our orders are to wait. Does anybody want to tell him that we're going to disobey orders? And all 7 men looked toward the corner of the house where they could just make out the dark shape of a man in a hooded cloak standing where he could see both the street and the rear entrance to Astor Mansion. None of the Bobbies wanted anything to do with the cloaked man. They would follow their orders. They turned back toward the door. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then the night exploded. The ear-splitting blast blew the rear door off its hinges so hard that it shattered against the garden wall 50 feet away. A huge tongue of flame came right behind it, blasting across the lawn, turning a wide swath of it black. Fortunately for them, none of the Bobbies were directly in front of the door when it blew, although all of them were thrown violently backward onto the ground. It was several seconds before they were able to get to their feet. They stared, ears ringing at the gaping, smoking hole where the door had been, trying to understand what had happened. It was then that they saw the ghost. And now we go back inside. When the flower bomb went off, Peter and Wendy, as Leonard had instructed them, were kneeling at the top of the stairway, facing the doors with their eyes closed and their hands clamped tightly over their ears. After the explosion, they waited a few seconds, then opened their eyes to see that the stairway was thick with dust and smoke. They stood up, coughing. The pounding on the door had stopped, but now had resumed, more frantic than before. Ready? Said Peter. Ready, said Wendy. Peter pulled Tink out from under his shirt. All right, he said, and Tinkerbell flew halfway down the hall and hovered. Wendy went down and stood next to her. Peter stepped to the side of the stairway and pressed himself against the wall. Don't forget to close your eyes, he said. I won't, said Wendy. Peter unlocked the door and turned the handle. It was several seconds before the pounding on the other side stopped and realized that the door was unlocked. It's open, shouted a voice. The door was pushed open and Peter was now concealed behind it. A Bobby stepped onto the stairs, followed by 2 more men. There's a girl, shouted the first one, spotting Wendy in the smoke. All 3 men started toward her. She closed her eyes, and as she did, Tinkerbell flashed her brightest light, filling the stairway with a blinding glare. The instant was gone, and Wendy opened her eyes and grabbed Tinkerbell, who was so weak from her effort that she could barely fly. Wendy turned and ran to the bottom of the stairs where Mrs. Bumbrake, Neville, John, and Michael were waiting. Wendy made it to the bottom and jumped out of the way just as 3 Bobbies, yelping in pain and fear, tumbled after her. Peter had shoved the first from behind. He had taken the other 2 down like bowling pins. They sprawled on the floor, moaning, still temporarily blind and unaware of the group of people, now quickly climbing the stairs. Hurry, whispered Peter. This way. He led them toward the smashed front door and out into the night. And now we go back outside. 4 of the 7 Bobbies in the back simply ran from the ghost. They had already been terrified by the explosion. The sudden appearance of the bizarre white figure flying over them, flying and waving a sword, was more than they could stand. They ran to the rear gate, opened it, and took off into Hyde Park. The other 3 Bobbies tried to battle with the ghost, but they had no chance. It swooped and darted above them, back and forth, easily evading the clumsy efforts to hit them with their nightsticks, while skillfully slashing them with the sword. In less than a minute, they too were running into the park, escaping from the flying fiend. So the authors have given us enough clues as to who the ghost would be. It needs to be somebody that can fly, somebody that's covered in white, and somebody that has a sword. So likely it would be Leonard, using the star stuff to help him to fly and being covered in flour. The little group stopped by an oak tree a few dozen yards from Astor Mansion in an area dimly lit by one of the street lamps. "Is she okay?" said Peter. "I think so," said Wendy, handing Tinkerbell to Peter. Tinkerbell's eyes were closed, but she was glowing. He held her for a moment, nodded, then gently put her into his shirt. "We need to get away from here," he said. "To where?" said Neville. "Lord Astor said we should go to a hotel near Sloane Square," said Peter. "I believe that would be this way," said Neville, pointing down the street, and as he did, the clang of a fire truck bell came from the other direction. "We better get going," said Peter. Wendy hesitated, looking back toward the house. "What about Grandfather?" "I'll go back and see." "I'm going with you," said Wendy. "No," said Peter, with a firmness that surprised even himself. "He's done everything he could so that you could escape. All that would be for nothing if you got caught now." Wendy nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right. I'll fly over the house and see." Then he heard a soft chime from Tinkerbell. And then he screamed in pain. Without knowing how he got there, he realized he was on his knees. The awful pain had receded from his body, but it had left him too weak to stand. He was aware that Wendy had screamed and that Michael and John were crying. He felt something on his neck, something rough and repellent, and all he knew that whatever it was causing the pain. He desperately hoped whatever it was would not cause it again. He would do anything to keep from feeling that pain again. He turned his head as much as he dared, and a man in a black cloak stood next to him. He had appeared to come out of the shadows by the tree. Peter hadn't heard him approach. "Don't move unless you want to feel that again," said the skeleton in a raspy voice. "Let him go," said Wendy. The skeleton turned toward her, and suddenly she saw his face by the dim streetlight. She screamed again. "Here now," said Neville, stepping towards the skeleton. "Let the boy—" "Ah!" The skeleton's movement was so quick that nobody saw it. He merely reached out and touched Neville's forearm, then withdrew his hand. But the touch sent an agonizing shock up Neville's arm into his shoulder. He stumbled away, groaning over Mrs. Bumbrake, who was staring in horror at the skeleton as she clutched the whimpering John and Michael. From the ground, Peter whispered, "Get away, all of you, run!" The others hesitated, not wanting to spend another second near the skeleton and not wanting to leave Peter. The skeleton broke the silence. "If you run away, any of you, this boy will feel a pain so unbearable that it will never leave him, however long he lives. Something far worse than this." His gnarled stump of a hand moved slightly towards the back of Peter's neck, and Peter fell to the ground, his entire body jerking in pain. "Shall I proceed?" said the skeleton. "No," whispered Wendy, "please." And as she spoke, the skeleton caught something in the corner of his eye, a white figure soaring over the house, like an angel. The skeleton saw Wendy's reaction and turned to see what had caused it. He whirled as Leonard, still covered head to toe in flour, landed 10 feet in front of him, sword in hand. He started carefully towards the skeleton. The skeleton shifted a bit to his right, angling his body sideways. "Don't let them," began Wendy. But before she could get the warning out, the skeleton, quick as a cat, had lunged toward Leonard, his claw hand darting out. Leonard, with star-stuff heightened senses, saw it coming. He vaulted into the air, just avoiding the skeleton's touch as he thrust out his sword to force the skeleton backwards. Leonard landed a few feet away, putting himself between the skeleton and the others. "Wendy, help Peter get up and away. Go where I told you, and do it now." "But now!" There was a note of desperation in Leonard's voice, and Wendy suddenly understood why. The star stuff was wearing off. She went to Peter, who was still on the ground moaning, and with Neville's help, she got him to his feet. Draping his arm over his shoulder, they started down the street as quickly as they could manage, trailed by Mrs. Bumbrake and the 2 boys. Behind them, the sound of the fire truck bells grew louder. After they had gone about 50 yards, Wendy looked back. Flames were erupting from the roof of the Astor Mansion, and by the light of the fire, Wendy could see 2 shapes near a big oak tree, one light and one dark, circling each other, each looking for an advantage. She turned back, hurrying with Peter down the dark street away from the horror behind them. She clung to the hope that her grandfather would somehow prevail and that she would see him again. She tried not to think about how weak he had become without the star stuff. They were almost to the end of the street. Ahead were the lights of Kensington Road. From behind her somewhere, Wendy heard a scream. And that's the end of what was a very, very long chapter. So there's a lot to think about with the ending of that chapter. The authors purposely don't tell you the outcome of the skeleton and Leonard's battle yet, but hopefully you can make some predictions on how the battle is going to go based on Leonard's condition with the star stuff. And then sometimes books will use symbolism where they have Leonard in white, which kind of represents the hero figure, and then of course the skeleton is very, very dark to match kind of his mood. The other question, of course, with the skeleton is it Slank? This chapter, there's a lot that points to the fact that maybe it is not Slank. The fact that he doesn't seem to say anything in regards to knowing Peter or Peter knowing him, same with Leonard, and also these abilities that the skeleton has with superpowers to cause pain. We really don't know where that would come from with Slank, since he appeared to be just an ordinary man in our early interactions with him in the book. So it's something that you're welcome to weigh in on or comment on if you feel like you have an idea on what the skeleton might be, but I feel like the evidence in this chapter leans towards skeleton as a new character and not Slank. Okay, so that was a long chapter. That's the only one we're going to do for the read aloud today. All right, keep watching.